By the time the county meeting ended, everyone in Laurel Fork knew what Nora Harlan had done. Pause. She had stood in front of a room full of farmers, bankers, and extension men, holding a dented coffee tin full of dark, wrinkled corn, and she had chosen that tin over the university's newest hybrid. Micro. Pause. The man on the stage, Dr. Preston Vale, made sure nobody missed the joke. He lifted his glossy seed catalog under the fluorescent lights, then pointed toward Nora's hands. With dry amusement, ladies and gentlemen, he said, this is why progress has to be taught more than once. Miss Harlan has inherited a farm, and apparently she intends to save it with chimney corner corn. FX low laughter spreading through a hall. The room laughed. Not cruelly at first, slower worse than that. Even that. They laughed with the confidence of people who believed the ending had already been written. Nora was 29 years old. 3 months earlier, she had buried the woman who raised her, her grandmother Ada Harlan, and inherited 116 acres of hard hill ground in the Cumberland foothills. The farm had one good spring, 2 tired barns, a mule shed that leaned like it was listening for bad news, and a banknote due before Christmas. The Harlan place was not the kind of farm men bragged about at the feed store. Its fields did not lie flat and clean. They folded around ridges and creek beds. The soil was thin on top, stubborn beneath, and full of stones that came back every spring, no matter how many buckets you carried away. Ada had worked that farm for 47 years. She had never called it poor land. She called it particular land. Pause. There is a difference. But the bank did not lend money on difference. It lent money on numbers. And Silas Creel, the banker, had given Nora the number plain. If the farm did not produce a cash crop strong enough to cover the note that season, he would begin foreclosure before the first frost. That was why Dr. Vale's demonstration mattered. The state university was promoting a new yellow hybrid called VX41, a corn bred to stand tall, take fertilizer hard, and deliver a heavy ear under managed conditions. The brochure said it could bring a county into the modern age. The salesman said it made old seed saving sentimental and dangerous. Nora had heard all of it. Then, 2 weeks after the funeral, she climbed into her grandmother's attic and found the thing Ada had left her. Not money, not jewelry, not a deed with no debt attached. Pause. A cedar trunk. SFX, old trunk, lid creaking open inside. It were 12 oilcloth notebooks, 6 cotton sacks, and 3 coffee tins sealed with waxed paper. "59 seasons of them. Rainfall, frost dates, blight years, flood marks on the creek bridge, which rows survived the dry summer of 1936, which ears filled even when July burned the pasture white, which stalks bent in wind and rose again by morning, which kernels stayed heavy through a winter when mice found nearly everything else. The seed in the tins was called Smokehouse Flint. Some kernels were the color of wet coal, some were burgundy, some were gray, blue with a pale stripe down the crown. None of them matched the clean, fat, yellow kernels in Dr. Vale's catalog. They looked almost dead. Quietly, but Ada's notebook said otherwise. Do not choose the tallest stalk, one line read. Choose the stalk that feeds after weather has had its say. Another line, written in Ada's mother's hand, was underlined twice. Pause. A crop that only knows a good year is not a crop. It is a gamble. That was the sentence Nora carried with her into the Grange Hall. Dr. Vale proposed the contest like a man offering mercy. 13 farms would plant VX. 41 under extension supervision. The university would log fertilizer, water, pest control, and yield. Nora's land would be recorded as a comparison plot, though he called it an educational curiosity. In August, the county would weigh the harvest. Modern science against attic seed, measured, witnessed, public. Every face turned toward Nora. Silas Creel stood near the back wall with his hat in his hands, already looking at her fields like property. Nora felt the coffee tin sweating in her palms. She could have walked out. She could have bought the hybrid on credit, sprayed when they told her to spray, fertilized when they told her to fertilize, and failed in a way everybody understood. Instead, she heard Ada's voice. Soft, firm, you do not owe shame to a room that never learned your land. So Nora looked at Dr. Vale and said, put it on the scale. SFX room drops quieter. The laughter stopped for half a second. Then it came back louder. Dr. Vale smiled as if she had done exactly what he needed her to do. In April, the county turned bright with new machinery. Planters moved across the valley in straight, shining lines. Men who had borrowed against their fall crop pulled tanks of anhydrous ammonia through dark earth. Bags of VX-41 were stacked in feed stores like sacks of certainty. Nora planted with a walk behind cedar. Ada had repaired so many times that no two bolts matched. She did not plant straight rows. She followed the land. Where the slope leaned, she curved the rows to hold rain. Where the soil went thin, she widened the spacing. Between the corn, she planted greasy beans from Ada's sacks, letting them climb the stalks and feed the soil. Along the low edges, she planted winter squash, not for beauty, but to shade the ground and keep weeds from stealing what little moisture the hills gave. From the road, it looked untidy. She heard 2 men at the co-op say Dr. Vale ought to take pictures before the weeds swallowed her. Jonah Reed, the young county agent assigned to monitor the trial, came every Monday with a clipboard and a soil probe. He had kind eyes and university habits. The first week, he measured her rows twice, as if the curve of them might be a mistake. The second week, he asked whether the beans were part of the crop, or just something she had not gotten around to pulling. By the third week, he stopped asking questions and simply wrote things down. Breath. Nora did not blame him. The whole field looked wrong if you had been trained to trust only what could be made uniform. Then, in early June, the first test came. SFX, distant thunder. A windstorm dropped out of the mountains after dusk. It hit with no courtesy. Rain slapped the windows sideways. The porch boards shook. Lightning showed Nora the cornfield in flashes, each flash worse than the last. The young plants were bending almost flat. Across the road, the VX-41 stood in clean ranks, thick and tall, fighting the wind like soldiers. Nora watched her own corn fold and twist until her stomach went hollow. For one terrible minute, all she saw was foolishness. Not tradition, not wisdom, slowly foolishness. She ran to the cedar trunk and found Ada's notebook from 1949, the year the Ridge barn lost its roof. The page was stained with rain or tears. Nora never knew which. The Flint does not win by standing proud, Ada had written. It wins by bowing soon enough. Nora went back to the porch. This time she watched differently. Her corn was not snapping, it was yielding. The stalks flattened under the gusts, then rolled with them, the leaves streaming like ribbons in dark water. The VX-40 one across the road kept resisting until resistance became breakage. SFX. Storm fading into morning birds. By morning, the difference was visible from the fence. Several acres of the hybrid lay cracked at the joints. Nora's field looked bruised and ashamed, but almost every stalk had lifted itself back toward the sun. Jonah came at noon. He walked the damaged rows across the road, then crossed into Nora's field without speaking. He knelt beside one of her plants and touched the green stem where it had bent. Only then did he write. Not in the box marked hate. Not in the box marked stand count. He wrote in the margin, pause bending response, unusual. That was the first official word the old corn ever won. June gave way to July, and July brought the kind of heat that makes men stop joking. The creek sank into its stones. The pond behind the church pulled back from its banks and left a ring of black mud. Cows stood under sycamores with their heads low, too tired to switch flies. Red dust hung behind every truck on the county road. VX-41 had been bred for a managed field. It wanted water when the schedule said water. It wanted nitrogen when the plan called for nitrogen. It wanted the world to behave like the brochure. Firmer, but the world did not. The hybrid corn grew fast at first, then began to pale. Its leaves curled into tight blades by noon. Its tassels came early and weak. The ears formed, then stalled, thin and poorly filled. Farmers borrowed again for irrigation pumps. They sprayed for stress pests. They poured more money into fields, already burning through it. Nora had no money to pour. She had Ada's notebooks. She hoed before sunrise. She mulched with straw from the back loft. She hauled water by barrel only to the youngest plants near the south slope, where the soil had cracked wide enough to swallow a finger. Every evening she walked the rows and looked for failure. She found some. She was not farming a miracle. A strip near the old road wilted and never recovered. Raccoons ruined 2 corners. Beetles chewed through leaves she could not afford to lose. And one afternoon, after Silas Creel left a foreclosure, notice folded into her screen door, Nora sat on the kitchen floor with Ada's notebook spread around her and cried until she could not read the handwriting. Pause, that was the lowest place. Not the public laughter, not the storm. The lowest place was realizing that the old seed could be right and still not be enough. The next morning, Dr. Vail arrived with Jonah in a university truck. He stepped out wearing a white shirt, too clean for July, and looked across Nora's field as if he had come to examine a superstition. He did not mock her this time. That made it worse. He offered help. There was still time, he said, to plow under the weakest section and replant a quick forage crop. The bank might consider that evidence of responsible management. The university could arrange a small input loan. Pride did not need to cost her the farm. Nora looked past him at the corn. The leaves were darker than the hybrids across the road. They did not shine the way the catalog corn had shined in May. They shone dull and waxy, almost blue in the heat. Ada had written about that too. A good leaf keeps its own shade. Nora asked Jonah for his soil probe. He hesitated, then handed it over. SFX metal soil probe pressing into dry earth. She pushed it down beside one of the older plants and hit resistance at 18 inches. She pushed harder. The probe slid through. At 30 inches, the soil came up cooler and darker, holding moisture like a secret. Jonah noticed. He took the probe back and tried again. Then again. By the 4th sample, he had stopped glancing at Dr. Vail. He walked to the VX-41 plot across the road and tested there. The topsoil was dry. Below it, the probe scraped almost clean. The hybrid roots had stayed shallow, waiting for help from above. Nora's corn had gone down. Breath reset. That did not save the story yet. It only changed the question. In late July, the insects came. Armyworms first, then aphids, then earworms that worked into the weak husks of the hybrid corn and stayed there like thieves in an unlocked house. The stressed plants had no fight left. Men sprayed until the valley smelled metallic at sunset. Nora's field drew insects, too, but it also drew everything that ate them. Lady beetles gathered on the bean vines. Lassowings hovered under squash leaves. Wasps threaded the rows. The field made noise, a low-living stitch of wings and leaves and heat. Jonah began bringing other men to the fence. At first, they stayed in their trucks. Then they got out. Nobody apologized. Not yet. But they looked differently. They saw the VX-41 plots, tall, organized, yellowing, full of empty promise. Then they saw Nora's field, shorter, darker, tangled, alive. One farmer, named Deke Wallace, finally said, "It still won't weigh out." He said it as a warning. Maybe to Nora, maybe to himself, because that was the final uncertainty. Survival was not the same as yield. The contest would not be decided by leaves or roots or how pretty a field looked in a bad summer. It would be decided by bushels weighed in public, written on paper, read aloud to the same people who had laughed. By August, the whole county had become quiet around Nora Harlan. Even Dr. Vale's newspaper column changed tone. He stopped calling the comparison plot sentimental. He began calling it anomalous. Micro. Pause, that word sounded scientific. It also sounded like a man putting a fence around something he did not understand. Harvest came under a gray sky. Jonah supervised the weighing himself. Every wagon was logged. Every moisture reading was recorded. Every field was measured again because nobody wanted the final numbers dismissed on a technicality. SFX wagon wheels, grain scale clanking the VX. 41 farms came in first. A few had partial yields. Most had almost none. The county average for the trial was 14 bushels per acre. Pause 14. In a normal year, that number would have been an embarrassment. In that year, it was a bankruptcy notice. Then they weighed Nora's crop. Her ears were smaller than the hybrid ears had promised to be. Nobody denied that. They were also filled to the tip. The kernels were hard, dark, heavy, and clean under the husk. Wagon after wagon crossed the scale. Jonah did the math twice. Then he made Dr. Vale check it. At the September meeting, the Laurel Fork Grange Hall was so full that men stood outside the open windows. Nora sat in the second row with the same coffee tin in her lap. Dr. Vale stood on the stage, but this time he did not hold a catalog. His hands were empty. Jonah read the report. 13 VX, 41 participating farms, including the university demonstration plot, averaged 14 bushels per acre after drought, wind damage, and pest pressure. Nobody moved. Miss Nora Harlan's Smokehouse Flint, planted on contour with companion beans and squash, produced 91 bushels per acre. Pause for a moment. The room did not know what sound to make. 91 was not a miracle number. That was why it struck so hard. It was a farming number, a real number, a number that could pay a note, buy winter feed, repair a roof, and leave seed for next year. Someone near the back whispered, "Lord." Then an old woman began to clap. Not loud, just once. Then again. SFX. Hesitant clapping growing into a full hall. The room followed slowly, as if every hand had to admit something before it could move. Nora did not stand. She did not smile at Dr. Vale. She looked down at the coffee tin and placed one hand over the lid. The applause was not for winning a contest. It was for the sudden, uncomfortable knowledge that the county had mistaken memory for ignorance. 2 days later, Nora walked into Silas Creel's bank with a paper sack and paid the note in full. Silas counted the money 3 times. When he finished, he slid the stamped note across the desk without meeting her eyes. Nora folded it once and put it in her coat pocket. That should have been the end of the story. Lo, it was not. In October, Dr. Vale came to the Harlan farm alone. He parked by the road and stood at the fence while Nora tied seed ears under the porch roof. The best ears were not the biggest. She had learned that much. They were the ones taken from the plants that had stood through the whole season without asking for rescue. Dr. Vale removed his hat. "I was wrong," he said. Nora kept tying twine for a moment. Then she said, "About what part?" It was not a cruel question. It was a farmer's question. A man should know the shape of the thing he is apologizing for. Dr. Vale looked at the rows of drying corn, at the beans hanging in paper bundles, at the squash curing near the steps. "I thought the seed was old because nobody had improved it," he said. "I did not understand that the hard years were the improvement." Pause. That was the first honest sentence Nora ever heard from him. He asked to study the notebooks. But she let him sit at Ada's kitchen table and read them with clean hands. Together with Jonah, they wrote a report that winter. Not a triumph piece. Not a sermon against science. Nora would not allow that. Ada's notebooks were science too, just slower, less polished. Written by women who could not afford to be wrong because weather did not grant extensions. The report did not make Nora famous overnight. What it did was harder and more useful. It made people ask better questions. By spring, farmers from 3 counties brought Nora envelopes of seed they had almost thrown away. A brown bean that survived frost. A dent corn that tolerated wet feet. A tomato line that resisted the valley blight. A squash that would root again after the vine borer passed through. Nora used the prize money to start the Laurel Fork seed room in the back of the old feed store. 1 shelf became 3. 3 shelves became a locked cabinet. By the end of 10 years, the cabinet held 42 local varieties, each in a labeled jar, each with a card that named the family, the field, the weakness, the strength, and the year it had proved itself. By the end of 26 seasons, Nora had not taken another operating loan. Pause. That was the number she cared about most. Not because debt is always shameful, because on that particular farm, freedom meant planting for the season that might come, not the payment somebody else had scheduled. Dr. Vale kept visiting. His hair thinned. His suits grew less impressive. Eventually, he stopped arriving with answers and came with students instead. Nora let them walk the fields, but she made them carry buckets of stone before they carried clipboards. A person should know the weight of the land before pretending to measure it. Years passed. The county changed. Farms consolidated. Seed catalogs grew thicker. Tractors grew larger. Men who once laughed at Nora grew old enough to tell the story as if they had known she was right all along. Nora never corrected them. She had better work to do. On her porch, late in life, she sat beside her granddaughter, June, with Ada's notebooks open between them. The girl traced the old handwriting with one finger, while jars of Smokehouse Flint caught the evening light along the windowsill. The kernels no longer looked dead. They looked patient. June read the underlined sentence aloud, softly. A crop that only knows a good year is not a crop. It is a gamble. Nora listened to the wind move through the rows below the house. She thought of Dr. Bale's catalog, bright and clean and certain, printed for a perfect season that never arrived. Then she thought of the coffee tin, dented dark, unimpressive, full of weather the seed had already survived, and she understood, finally, what Ada had left her. Not the past, not a relic. A record of endurance written small enough to fit in a palm. The catalog had promised what corn could do when the world behaved. The seed remembered what corn must do when it did not.